Hi, welcome back to class. I want to go over the survey of Matthew 16, 1 to 20. This passage is an interesting one, and you may remember from looking at the broader Gospel of Matthew that this particular segment is not only important because in it Peter makes the confession about Jesus, but this segment comes in a key position in the Gospel. This is the last segment of the large middle part of Matthew's Gospel that runs from 4:17. Remember, from that time on, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And this whole middle section of the Gospel, which runs from 4:17 all the way through 16:20, is the presentation of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, and in particular, it's Jesus's announcement of the kingdom of heaven. And he offers it, he presents the kingdom, he announces the kingdom in word and in deed. So you can think how when we began the term, we talked a lot about this during our intensive time. We talked about how the first part of 4:17 to 16:20, roughly 4:17 through 11:1, was Jesus announcing the kingdom in word and deed. And then we saw 9:35 to 11:1, Jesus sending out his disciples to do that. From 11:2 through 16:20, we essentially are seeing the response to Jesus's announcement of the kingdom in word and deed. And that response is mostly a rejection of Jesus. When we did the parable of the sower, essentially chapter 13, that the parable, all the parables that are the parables of the kingdom, they serve a dual function. Part of the function is to explain how is it possible that Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, was rejected to the extent that he ultimately is going to be crucified in this last section of the gospel from 16:21 to 28:20, this part that we'll be turning to for the rest of the semester. And so they explain essentially a theology of unbelief, right? So if you think back to the sower, we looked at why is it that the word of the kingdom doesn't grow in every person, and we talked about some ways. Now, at the same time, the parables also serve a positive function as they encourage the disciples to continue to minister with the certainty that the kingdom is going to continue to expand. So now we reach in the section that we're looking at for this assignment, this climactic segment in this section where we do see a parting of the ways, right? And so when you work through this material, you probably found it somewhat challenging to survey. It's all narrative with some conversation here between Jesus and his disciples, but it's easy to see where the breaks are here, but to do the structural analysis takes a little bit of work. So I want to look at this in a couple ways. I'm going to walk through the survey. You can look at my notes. They're already uploaded here near where the video is posted. So make sure you get my survey notes out. By the way, there's also some interpretation notes on Peter's confession. It wasn't required in the survey, but I do have the interpretive notes if you'd like to look at those too, again, to see a model for what an interpretation would look like. So when we look at the survey, it breaks in fairly easily into three chunks, and these are really the three paragraphs. So you have verses 1 to 4, where you have Jesus and the Pharisees. You have verses 5 to 12, where it's the yeast of the Pharisees. Jesus is talking with his disciples, so we might want to put the disciples here. So we have it, and we have yeast of the Pharisees. And then we have the last section, 13 to 20. They're now at Caesarea Philippi. And you have Peter's confession. So the question ends up being, how do you organize these three sections into units, these three paragraphs into units, and what are the structural relations that move through there. And I want to suggest a couple things. I think the easiest way to break this up is to essentially see two main units here. With the first one being essentially a confrontation with religious leaders, specifically the Pharisees, and then this becomes a warning to the disciples in some ways, while simultaneously being around a key issue. And what's the issue in these first two things? It's really the issue in the whole piece. It's who is Jesus? What's the identity of Jesus, and how does one acquire that knowledge? So if you notice what happens in these first two stories, again, there is a contrast here, and we'll talk about this in a minute, between the disciples and the Pharisees. But let me read through 16, 1 to 12 quickly. And let's just talk about a couple things here. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, and they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Then he left them and went away. So notice that the Pharisees are unable to understand who Jesus is or interpret the signs, right? And essentially, Jesus' ministry up to this point has been a demonstration of the inbreaking of the kingdom through both his words and through his deeds. So there's been plenty of evidence, right? There's been plenty of seeds sown, you might say. So it's not that there haven't been signs already. It's that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are unable to interpret them, right? And so the ultimate sign that Jesus is going to give is going to be the sign of Jonah, which is ultimately going to be, that's looking towards his death and his resurrection, right? But now listen to what happens with the disciples. And notice their predicament as we read this. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." They said to one another, "It is because we have brought no bread." And becoming aware of it, Jesus said, "You have little faith." We'll come back to that phrase here at the end. "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you've gathered?" Okay, notice the phrases there. You have little faith. And now he mentions the 5,000 and also the 4,000. If you know Matthew's gospel, if you just turn the page back in your Bible, he just fed the 4,000 in chapter 15. That was the last thing that happened before chapter 16. So he's citing backwards. And we've also heard Jesus say, "You have little faith," previously. When Peter was walking on water, when Jesus calmed the storm, that's in chapter 8. And then back in the Sermon on the Mount, in the context of chapter 6, he says, "You have little faith," when he's talking about worrying about things. So Jesus is connecting with the disciples on things that have already happened previously. So the disciples have had it clearly demonstrated to them in one-on-one teaching with Jesus about who Jesus is. And so then, verse 11, how could you fail to perceive that I was not talking about bread? Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he had not told them to be aware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Notice a key piece. The disciples are unable to understand who Jesus is also, unless Jesus specifically breaks it down and reveals it to them. Just like we saw back in chapter 13 with the parables. He tells a parable, the disciples don't get it, Jesus gives them an explanation. So notice this, the issue here is ultimately revelation. How does one deal with revelation? And so the Pharisee references connect these first two sections together. So we definitely want to connect two sections here. In the first section, we want verses 1 to 4 and verses 5 to 12. And again, you can broadly call this a confrontation with religious leaders. Or you could also talk about another alternative way of talking about this was the inability to perceive who Jesus is. This whole broader piece is about Jesus's true identity as Son of God, Messiah. So that's what's at stake. Okay, then the second unit here is Peter's confession. Notice the setting at Caesarea Philippi. If we're going to do an interpretation, it would be important to look up the significance of that historical site. You can check that out in the notes. But the question is being, who is Jesus? So the beginning of this, let's go ahead and read this. Now Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now we have the crowds essentially brought in, right? So it's not just the Pharisees and the scribes. It's going to be all the people. And they said, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Specifically the discipleship group now. And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So Peter's got it right? And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For, substantiation, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Right? And so the second piece ends up being the confession of the disciples. Now, in a sense, this is Peter's confession, but as you'll see in my interpretation, I argue that Peter is more a representative of all the disciples than being a unique figure in and of himself. So these are the reasons I would go with 2 units, because in these first the first two smaller pieces, 1 to 4 and 5 to 12, there's enough pieces to connect them with the issue of persons who are unable to perceive or understand specifically who Jesus is, over against now, broadly, Peter is able to say specifically and precisely who Jesus is in his fullness. But notice the key piece there. Well, how is it that Peter knows this? It's because it's been given to him by God the Father. He's been given special, specific revelation. Just kind of like we saw in the parable of the sower, right? It's about the soil. It's about being prepared, and he gets this specific word from the Father, and he's able to bring it in and make this confession. So that's what's going on here. So let's talk about some of the structures that we see. Well, I think the first structure that we see for sure would be essentially a preparation realization, with the sense that the first section, verses 1 to 12, functions to prepare us for the second main unit. And so we have the first unit prepares in this sense. Jesus continued confrontation with religious leaders. So in verses 1 to 4, we see the issues with the Sadducees and with the Pharisees, right? And so they're unable to recognize or unwilling to recognize who Jesus is. Secondly, we see in 4b that Jesus is withdrawing from the public, which is going to set us up for this private conversation with the disciples. Thirdly, the disciples themselves are unable to get it. We see that illustrated in 5 to 12. So they have a problem with perception. And again, fifth thing that we see is that it's the issue of the Pharisees holds us together, and then issue of interpreting signs. All of that is going to be realized in Peter confessing who Jesus is in the second piece. So of course we're going to ask questions, and I'm not going to read all the questions as I go through this video, but for preparation and realization, we can ask things like this. What is the precise and specific meaning of these 5 elements? How do they function to prepare the reader for Peter's confession in verses 13 to 20? Why does Matthew introduce Peter's confession with this material, and what are the implications? Again, remember, definitional, rational, implicational. Okay, so what are some other structures? A second structure that I think we can identify here would be problem solution. And I'm not specifically talking about the recurrence of questions that we have. You may note that as a structure, but I'm talking about it as a whole. This entire piece is set up as problem solution. What I mean by that is the problem is essentially the inability to recognize Jesus. The solution is revelation. Now, this solution is in part implicit in verses 5 to 12 because Jesus teaches the disciples, right? So we begin to see it hinted at here, but the fullest solution to this problem is Peter confessing because it's been revealed to him by the Father. So we want to see that as problem solution, connecting these two pieces. Okay, so what are some other structures that show up here? Well, let me list a couple of other things, and again, you want to look at these in the notes. First, we see a recurrence of biographical contrast. And why do I say biographical? Because this is a contrast of persons, right? So we're going to have the Pharisees, Sadducees, and even the people are going to be on one side, and they're going to be contrasted with the disciples on the other side of all of this. Again, the issue is going to be the disciples are going to understand who Jesus is. The Sadducees, Pharisees, and the people are going to misinterpret who Jesus is. So there's going to be a contrast there. Now, there's also, I think, a recurrence of comparison. And again, this is biographical comparison. And in this sense, the disciples, religious leaders, and the people are all compared around the issue of how does one understand the identity of Jesus, right? Because the disciples don't get it partially in 5 to 12, though they're going to understand it fully at the end. So there's a bit of comparison here. So you see a little bit, so on the one sense, in the contrast, the disciples are over against the Pharisees. On the other one, everybody's kind of in the same boat. And the key difference is going to be this whole issue about revelation and revealing ultimately who Jesus is. The last structure that we can look at that's very significant here is going to be that of climax. Now, the climax of this passage, and arguably the climax of 4:17 through 16:20 as a whole, is going to be Peter's confession, verses 16 and Jesus' response to Peter's confession, verses 17 to 20. It's going to be the climax of the whole piece here, because we're going to see key pieces. We're going to see Peter confessing Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, which is precisely who Jesus is. We're then also going to see Jesus' response, which is a blessing in naming that he's received this from the Father, a renaming of Peter, a renaming of Simon to Peter, the whole business of authority, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and the warning to the disciples not to reveal Jesus' identity. And I think with the key piece of that, wonder why he want him to tell them. It's going to come back in the next section, because we're not going to completely get Jesus' full identity apart from understanding the rest of Jesus' ministry, which is going to be the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So those are the structures. These are some of the things. You may have found others, but these are some of the key ones here. And again, look in my notes for how I describe the structures, how for each structure there's a description, there's questions for each structure, and then I have a list of strategic areas that give you the best place where we can start some more interpretive work. Now, the literary form here, this is a narrative, so that one's pretty easy, but I do want to note a couple of other impressions. Again, notice where it comes in the book. This is the last segment of the big middle division of Matthew, right? So it's a climactic section, a couple of different levels. Secondly, it's obvious that the focus is on Jesus' identity and that contrast between those who know it, the disciples, and those who can't, despite all of the signs that Jesus has given. The third thing is, this is mostly an insider conversation, because from verses 5 to the end, Jesus is only with his disciples. So notice that break between those who have, those who don't. That kind of the paradoxes that we see that issue around the revelation. And then the fourth thing, notice that we have Peter's confession is at Caesarea Philippi, and that's going to be a significant place. We also want to say that there's links to other parts of Matthew's gospel, so that you of little faith, I mentioned where that shows up. The sign of Jonah also shows up back in chapter 12:38 to 42. And then I mentioned the miraculous feedings of the 4,000 and the 5,000, which show up in chapters 14 and 15. So this is a carefully constructed unit that connects with the flow, and it sets us up for the final turn in Matthew's gospel, which is going to be starting at 16:21. Jesus is moved to the cross. And if you haven't looked ahead, look how the last division starts off. It's the same language that we saw with 4:17. From that time on, from what time? Peter's confession. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Okay, look forward to seeing your next work. I'll have your work back on 16:1 to 20 shortly. Check out the notes. Ask any questions that you have. And again, I'm Brian Russell, and I will see you next time.